Okay, so let's talk about these new tariffs President Trump is planning to announce on cars imported into the U.S. It feels like a pretty big deal for U.S. trade policy. I mean, we've seen a bunch of stuff from this administration already, but this seems like it could be a significant shift. We're expecting the official announcement later today, Wednesday. But, it sounds like this came out of nowhere, right? There have been some hints dropped, and April 2nd has been mentioned as a kind of a key date. Trump even called April 2nd Liberation Day, which I guess gives you a sense of the tone here. And it makes sense when you remember that Stellantis, Ford, and General Motors, they all got these exemptions from that planned 25% tariff on all goods from Canada and Mexico. And those exemptions, while they were tied to the USMCA agreement. And guess what? They expire on April 2nd. Trump basically said last week that he was giving American car companies a break until that. So that's the backdrop. But here's the thing. But there's still a lot we don't know about these new tariffs. Like, what's the exact percentage going to be? When exactly do they go into effect? And will they apply to all cars or just the finished ones? Or will they also include the parts that go into making the cars? Remember those discussions about a possible 25% tariff on everything imported from Canada and Mexico? If that happened to car parts, we'd be talking billions of dollars in impact. Trump has hinted that the new tariffs could be somewhere around 25%. And to make things even more interesting, an automotive lobbyist said that the industry is kind of expecting a 25% tariff specifically on finished cars imported starting April 2nd. But they also think there might be some parts that are left out, and maybe some special arrangements for cars that have enough US-made content. But like I said, the details are still pretty murky. So I know what you're thinking, right? What does all this mean for the price of my next car? That's the big question. I mean, pretty much every car these days has parts from Mexico and Canada. The Peterson Economic Group did an analysis, and they said if these tariffs include car parts, it could add anywhere from $3,500 to $12,000 to the cost of making a car here in the U.S. That's huge. To give you some context, right now, under the trade rules, parts made in Canada and the U.S. are treated the same when it comes to domestic content. So even if you really stretch the definition of American made, no car right now has more than 75% domestic parts. But here's the thing, even if they only put tariffs on the finished cars and other parts, we're still probably going to see car prices go up, because it could mean that some of those cheaper options like the Chevrolet Blazer and the Honda HR-V, which are both made in Mexico, it might just disappear. Those cars, they often have really thin profit margins, and they can only be so cheap because labor costs are lower in Mexico. And it's not just about price either. We might also see less variety when we go to buy a car. Like one person in the industry said, fewer choices. That's a likely outcome. And it's not just those smaller, cheaper cars that are made in Mexico that could get more expensive. These tariffs could hit cars you don't even realize are imported, like those heavy-duty Ram pickup trucks. They're built in Mexico. And some versions of the Chevrolet Silverado are made there too. Even if the car companies decided to move production of those profitable trucks back to the U.S., that would take years. So let's step back for a second and look at the bigger picture. S&P Global Mobility found that in 2024, Mexico made 4 million vehicles, and 2.5 million of them, like 61%, were shipped to the U.S. Big companies like General Motors, Ford, Stellantis, the ones who make Ram, Dodge, Jeep, Chrysler, and then Toyota, Honda, Hyundai, Nissan, Mazda, Mitsubishi, Mercedes-Benz, Volkswagen, they all had assembly plants in Mexico. And that Canada made 1.3 million vehicles last year, and 1.1 million of those, or 86%, were exported to the U.S. But these tariffs wouldn't just affect Canada and Mexico. If those 3.6 million cars from our neighbors suddenly get way more expensive, it could hurt U.S. auto parts plants that supply those assembly lines. Federal trade data says that last year the U.S. sent $35.8 billion worth of parts to Mexico, and another $28.4 billion to Canada. And here's the kicker. U.S. parts suppliers employ something like 550,000 workers. That's almost twice as many people as work in car assembly. So if the Canadian and Mexican plants have to slow down or even close temporarily, those U.S. parts suppliers might have to cut production and jobs. And on top of that, the U.S. exports a lot of cars to Canada and Mexico too, $14.9 billion to Canada and $4.6 billion to Mexico. If those countries decide to fight back with their own tariffs on U.S. cars, some U.S. assembly plants might have to scale back. Cox Automotive estimates that if tariffs are put on both car parts and finished cars, we could see about 30% of North American car production stop. That's like 20,000 cars a day not being made. So why is Trump doing this? Well, he says it's to get more money to help pay for those tax cuts, and also to help bring back the U.S. industrial base, which has been shrinking for a long time. Is it possible that Trump will use a 2019 national security investigation into car imports to justify these tariffs? That investigation said that the growing number of imported cars was a threat to national security, and he suggested tariffs between 25 and 35% on certain vehicles, although those never actually happened at the time. As soon as the news about these planned tariffs came out, shares of U.S. car companies dropped. Investors are worried these tariffs could really mess things up in the global car industry, which is already dealing with a lot of uncertainty because of Trump's, back and forth on tariffs. The whole U.S. stock market closed lower too because of these worries about tariffs, which have been freaking investors out for most of this month. So what's next? Cox Automotive has made some predictions. If there aren't any special exceptions for the car industry on imports from Mexico and Canada, they think the price of a U.S.-made car could go up by $3,000, and a car made in Canada or Mexico could go up by $6,000. If the tariffs do happen, Cox thinks pretty much all North American car production will be disrupted by the middle of April, which could lead to 20,000 fewer cars being made every day. That's about a 30% drop. Jonathan Smokes is the chief economist at Cox. He said that in the long term, they think sales will go down, both new and used car prices will go up, and some models might even disappear completely if the tariffs stay in place. He also said that we don't have many details yet about possible tariffs on the European Union, Japan, and South Korea. But overall, he thinks we're looking at less production, less supply, and higher prices. Kind of like what happened in 2021. Cox has also noticed that the incentives car companies are offering are already shrinking. Charlie Chesbrook, who's a senior economist at Cox, he said that the new car market could be heading for more inflation. Right now, the average price someone pays for a new car is $48,039, which has been higher than last year but lower than the peak back in December 2022. Chesbrook thinks prices will probably start rising a lot faster because of these tariffs. And there's also the chance that fewer new cars will be sold and that there will be job losses because the U.S. car industry depends so much on parts from other countries. In 2024, the U.S. imported $474 billion worth of car stuff, including $220 billion in passenger cars. And the biggest suppliers were Mexico, Japan, South Korea, Canada, and Germany. It's important to see these car tariffs as part of a bigger picture. Trump is trying to change the way the U.S. does trade. He's been going after all these free trade agreements that have been in place for decades. Like just recently on March 12th, a 25% U.S. tariff on steel and aluminum imports from every country went into effect. And in response, the European Union announced their own tariffs on $28 billion worth of U.S. goods starting in April. But they did postpone some of those tariffs until the middle of April, including a big one on American whiskey. And then with Canada and Mexico, Trump's 25% tariffs on everything from those countries start on March 4th. But 2 days later, he said he was pausing those tariffs for goods and services that follow the USMCA until April 2nd. Canada also retaliated against the steel and aluminum tariffs with their own tariffs on about $20 billion of U.S. goods. And the two countries agreed to start new trade talks. And then with China, the U.S. put in place new tariffs of about 20% on top of the existing 10% tariffs. And China retaliated with tariffs of up to 15% on U.S. farm goods, which started on March 10th. And lastly, Trump said the U.S. will put a secondary tariff on Venezuela starting April 2nd, which means any country that buys oil or gas from Venezuela will get hit with a 25% tariff when they trade with the U.S. So to sum up, these new car tariffs that Trump announced, they're going to cause some big changes in the car industry and the whole economy. We'll have to see what happens in the next few days to get a better idea of the specifics and how big the impact will be. If you found this informative, be sure to like and subscribe for more deep dives into current events. Thanks for listening.